Thank you, Frank, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. Well, here it is, fear not. I begin by saying fear not because anxiety seems to be a feature of discourse about technologies of reading, technologies of intellectual interpretation. The locus classicus for this is in Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, Englished as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, in which at one point the wicked archdeacon holds up one of the newfangled printed books, brandishing it against the sky and the spires of Notre Dame, and cries out, "This will kill that." I remember that story because it was repeated in 1994 in the strangest country I have ever visited, San Marino, landlocked in Italy, a country which lives, it turns out, on its postage stamps and crossbows, at a conference on the future of the book, at which the closing discourse was given by Umberto Eco. And Eco chose that as the theme of his talk, brandishing what was then called a laptop. I think it weighed about 14 pounds in 1994, and a paperbacked book, and said, "Now, will this kill that?" The power of technologies of reading to change societies is a theme of much modern scholarship, and we've now found ourselves living in a time in which change seems to be happening around us, and we brandish this change in this form of cultural icon and artifact. Having spent a fair amount of time thinking about that history and about the role of electronic technology in classrooms and publishing and scholarship, when this thing fell into my hand a few months ago, I said I had better discipline myself, not simply to start using it, but to thinking about it and seeing what I can learn from it. And I'm here today to share some of the fruits of that conversation. The first fear not that I should emphasize is this is not going to be a product review of the Kindle. Cicero was famous for developing the rhetorical tactic of the praeteritio, the passing by, the making no mention of things. In his form it would say, "I make no mention of your accounts in the Caymans, I make no mention of your bastard children, I'm here today to talk about your policies." I will try to make as little mention as possible of the quirks and foibles of this particular device. And that, I think, is only fair because this device is one device in a history that rapidly evolves. This is already 3 months old. The iPad will be released in a few weeks, and all the blogosphere is alert to what Bezos will do next with the Kindle in order to compete with the iPad and so forth. So many of the things that one can complain about in a device of this kind will in fact go away in a short period of time. So I will not talk about the funny screen. I will not talk about the weirdest choice of all, it seems to me, making the surrounding frame white, thereby emphasizing that the screen isn't really white. In other words, my surmise is if the surround were black, you might actually think the screen was white. But when you make it a flat white, the screen is a kind of dull gray against which the black characters appear. I will not complain about the funny chiclet keyboard down here at the bottom that can only be done one letter at a time and then usually wrongly. I might complain slightly, and this is under the category of crippled functionality, about the fact that the search engine which they offer is not as smart as Google's and is therefore unforgiving of typographical errors. Until I used this, in fact, I had not realized just how sloppy I was becoming about spelling, because Google can always figure out what I really meant to say and give me good answers in spite of it. One letter off with this and you get absolutely zero results, and you have to go back and figure out where the chiclets went wrong for you. There is other crippled functionality. It does have network connection. It has the most useless web browser that I have ever seen. But it's easy to assume that sometime in the not too distant future, that browser will be improved so that the Kindle can continue to compete with other devices. I will not complain about the battery life. It's one of the few devices whose battery life I will not complain about. It really does last a very long time, and that's good news. What I will complain about, however, is my travel load, in which now, when I take a trip of more than a few days and find myself checking into a room in, let's say, New Delhi, I now find that I am crawling around on the floor trying to match electrical plug adapters to electrical plugs for no fewer than 6 different rechargeable devices at one time. The notion that this now has added itself as the 6th does not please me in its own right. It's a reminder that we live in a space and with a bag full of gadgets, each of which comes with an incompatible plug, adapter, whatever, to go with it, and attention must be paid. On the train today, I discovered that my BlackBerry hadn't been properly plugged in overnight, so I'm now on BlackBerry rationing today. And some of you who do indeed know me recognize what an austere discipline that is for me. I pass over all those things and do not talk about them. I would almost pass over a few other things and meant to pass over them, but I find that I cannot. It is a feature of this device that it takes only proprietary texts. There is a way to download document files and PDF files. I will simply say I haven't made that work very well for me so far. But essentially, it will only acquire book formats if they have been converted by Amazon or if they come from Amazon's Kindle store. And so I will let myself complain about the extraordinarily limited selection of titles that are available. And this is even a consumer warning when Amazon tells you that there are 300 or 400,000 titles available for the Kindle. What they are not telling you is there are really about 30,000 titles available for the Kindle of things that you and I might call books. And then there is an almost infinite supply of shovelware, that is to say, digitized, out of copyright online texts, which various entrepreneurs, some of them perhaps Yale students, have put together in a form to upload to Amazon to sell to you for $1.99 or $2.99. There's an almost infinite number of copies of some classic works of literature available in this price range. And that's the point at which I will say that the metadata that come with these texts in the Kindle store is beyond horrible. One of the first things I did when I got my device was tell myself that I needed to download to it an unabridged copy of the greatest novel ever written. Count of Monte Cristo, you know that. Count of Monte Cristo is a challenge to find in unabridged form in American bookstores and libraries anyway, but it turned out to be a triple challenge to find in the Kindle store. There were at least a dozen different versions of the Count of Monte Cristo and no reliable data to suggest what kind of edition, what kind of translation, or whether you were getting the whole thing or not. The only way to know whether you got the whole thing was to spend $1.99 on it, I could afford it, download it, and then see how many locations. Each Kindle text has a certain number of locations. And if the number was really big, then it's probably unabridged. That's an amateurish way to know what sort of object you are buying. It makes me nostalgic for the old bound volumes of books in print that used to be behind the counter at the bookstore, where at least you had reliable bibliographical data. But I pass over these things, and I do not mention them either, except perhaps to linger on my curious discovery of my price resistance. I'm willing to pay about $1.99 for anything. So far, I haven't paid more than $9.99 for anything. And I can't bring myself to spend more than $9.99. And I'll spend the $9.99, and I'll say a couple of the things I've bought in a while, when it's not available otherwise. I went looking for a novel I wanted to read. It turns out to be out of print and unavailable except in old used copies. For $9.99 on the Kindle, what the heck, it's not a novel I much care about. But I spent, in fact, my first week in possession of a thing, trying to convince myself to buy a new hardcover book, an important book. The one that has held me up for the longest is Orhan Pamuk's new novel, The Museum of Innocence. I'll come back to that. I cannot persuade myself to buy that for the Kindle. This is not a rational reaction. I'm simply reporting a physical fact about myself. When facing the screen that says, buy Museum of Innocence now, it doesn't happen. And I can't very well explain why, except that there's something wrong with the price and value equation. What I do want to talk about, however, are the reading practices that are predicted, rehearsed, prescribed by this device and this kind of device. Tools leave traces. One of my colleagues on that Library of Congress study that Frank referred to taught us that aphorism, which is to say that whatever it is you use to do your work leaves traces on the work itself, leaves traces on the way you do your work. Many sorts of technologies and structures predict, rehearse, and impose forms of behavior upon us. This podium behind which I am standing imposes a certain kind of authority relationship in this room. It was designed to do so. It does reasonably well. I learned this one time when we were trying to design a new classroom in a building that had been remodeled in the early days of network technology. And I said, no, don't leave all the plugs in the wall. Put the plugs for power and network in the floor in the middle of the room so that devices can be on the table, on the seminar table. I had seen a room before that in which the plugs were all in the wall, and professors teaching in the room spent a lot of time doing this. And I had no particular appetite for doing that. Well, it was complicated, it was expensive, putting power on the floor cost more than putting power on the wall, but we were stubborn, we persisted, we got that, we got into the room after it had been remodeled. It was about half the size of this, but this shape. And as soon as we sat down at the table, we realized that the people who had done the task still understood what kind of pedagogy we must want to employ in the room. The power jacks and the network jacks were all up at one end of the table, where Herr Professor could use them, rather than in the middle, where there could be any more democratic access to them. And Herr Professor was required to stand at the front of the room by the blackboard, when this Herr Professor actually wanted to sit at the other end of the table with the blackboard at the opposite end, the students between, and a more collegial and discussion-based form of teaching going on. Devices and technologies predict behavior. This device predicts behavior. When I think about this device and its predictions and its impositions, as a scholar, a working scholar in the humanities, history and literature and culture, then I start running up into the practices that I cannot employ. The Kindle allows you to annotate text, for example. But by annotate text, what it means is that you may choose to highlight a body of text, or you may choose to attach a note to a body of text. It's rather like the comment feature in Microsoft Word, for example. But what it then does not allow you to do is rifle through your notes, rearrange them, extract them, put them someplace else. 3x5 cards were more complicated devices onto which to transfer the information, but vastly more functional as devices for sorting and using information. And somewhere between the 3x5 card and the Kindle, I realize I've developed practices in the internet world and on my computers that allow me to cut and paste, that allow me to reorganize, to take quotations that I've put in my notes and plop them directly into my text without inaccuracy. I may be the only person anywhere in the blogosphere who keeps his personal blog entirely secret from the rest of the world, because it's not for you, it's for me. It's the place I take notes. It's under a pseudonym. It's not searchable. If you ever found it, which would be by accident, you wouldn't know who put it together. But at any internet-connected machine in the world, except this one, that I find myself sitting, I can cut and paste, I can make notes, I can put them in what we now think fashionably of as the cloud, and the notes follow me around wherever I go. Perfectly functional, more functional than 3x5 cards, vastly more functional than what this device allows. This device is not friendly to that scholarly business of annotation. It is also not friendly to complex documents. And I don't know that I ever would have said, until I got a device like this, but I insist on reading complex documents. But I do insist on reading complex documents. I need not only footnotes. Footnotes are clunky in the Kindle. You have to click on the footnote call and wait a moment while it goes and fishes out just the note, displays it on screen. Then you have to hit the back button to go back to where you are. Even the hideous notes in the back of printed books are easier to use than that technology. But I also need maps and diagrams. I need to flip back and forth. I need to be able to put my fingers in a page. I need to be able to put two things side by side. Sometimes I need to be able to have the text running down one side of the page and a translation down the other. None of these things can I do in this space. This is, in many respects, the old papyrus roll brought back to life, in which you begin scrolling at the beginning, and the natural way to read the object is to keep scrolling and keep scrolling and keep scrolling until you finally come to the end and find the colophon. The colophon was the Greek word meaning be kind, rewind, which was used in all the papyrus scrolls of ancient times. The Kindle drives you away from nonlinear access to text, which has been a feature of the Codex book for 500 years now, and back towards something more like scrolling, 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 scrolling. At one point, I found myself recalling from my doctoral dissertation days here, sitting in a room not far from this spot, scrolling through a negative microfilm of a German dissertation that proposed to explore whether there was a relation between two particular works of ancient literature. This was the one where I discovered on about page 20 that I had a nagging suspicion and had to make the cost-benefit decision of, shall I scroll all the way through now to read the conclusion to see where this is going, knowing I'll then have to scroll all the way back. I did. I got all the way through to the end, and I found the last line of the dissertation in German said, and so we have shown conclusively that there is no relationship between these two works of literature. Fortunately, then I could do the automated rewind and be done with it. the same kind of cost-benefit decision imposes itself upon you when you read this device. I have needs as a scholar. I need particular standard works of reference, particular standard works of texts. I can't accept substitutes. I might be able to go online, and I confess I do it, and find badly edited and transcribed Latin texts in something called the Latin Library. I even use Wikipedia. I try not to use it more than 50 or 100 times a day because I am a serious scholar. But I need, for scholarly purposes, to find other works of reference, other documents, other particular devices. I've spent an inordinate amount of time in the last 2 days tracking down editions of a standard old history of Latin literature, published originally in 1890, reproduced in 1927. I discover that I can find full text in Google books of the 1890 version. I've compared and contrasted. I still want the 1927. Fortunately, I found a copy for $15 on Abe Books, and so that will come and sit next to my Kindle. I wish it were in my Kindle. I wish I had it electronically. I do not. Let me pause there and say that in describing some of these shortcomings of the device and the practices of the device, I'm well aware that they are not all to be laid at the doorstep of the vendor, the manufacturer. There are challenges in the intellectual property environment in which we work that make it difficult for us to have access to all the things that we know we could easily have access to. On another day and in another place, I find I am supposed to give a talk in which I talk about the Google book settlement, and I would say here only that I find it perplexing that there has been as little gratitude shown to Google as there has been for spending $250 or $300 million digitizing books, and for finding some way in which we will be able to get access to electronic representations of literally hundreds of thousands to millions of books. I might like a different settlement, I might like them freer, I might like them cheaper, I might like a bunch of things, but I hope I at least remember to say thank you somewhere along the way. Google Books, horrible as the metadata may be, is. But I need standard works, I need specific editions. I don't just need a copy of the Count of Monte Cristo if I'm writing about the Count of Monte Cristo. I probably want a first edition or representative edition of the first edition done by the appropriate scholars with appropriate care and attention. And that's because books talk to each other. Sterling Library and the places like it are temples of that kind of conversation. I often feel when the books are talking to each other that I'm really a spectator or only one of the participants in a conversation that's going on among the many artifacts that are upon my desk. This device is designed for me and one book to encounter each other and to make of each other the most that we can. I can do things with that, but I can't do all the things that I've been trained to do. I can't do all the things that I want to do. I will acknowledge that there is one supreme virtue to this object. It can hold a lot of stuff. I have no idea how much stuff it can hold. I'm pretty sure I haven't come anywhere close to filling it up yet. I could load it up, I could load it up, I could load it up. So what have I in fact done with it? Well, I can take you through the thought processes that have put in it what gets in it. First, I said, when I got this for Christmas, well, here I am on holiday doing something that in my advancing years I do more frequently, which is reading ancient literature in translation. I'm a classicist. I read lots of ancient literature in Greek and Latin, but there are works that I know I'm never going to go back to work on again seriously, that I still love in one form or another. And when traveling, and particularly on long trips with little access to books, I have found over the last few years that the Odyssey, the Iliad, Herodotus, this time it was Thucydides in Crawley's old translation, a fine piece of work, lovely to read, lovely to enjoy. I had the Everyman Library version. The Everyman Library, like the American Modern Library, was in its way the Kindle of its day, compact access to classic literature. So I found, it took some work, I downloaded Thucydides. The good news, the bad news is that I got the text. The good news is that I kept reading the text. The bad news is I still haven't quite finished Thucydides. I've got a couple of books to go. Come back to that. I then went and had my voyage of discovery finding the Count of Monte Cristo. That was successful. At various odd moments, I've read a few chapters here and there. The plot of Count of Monte Cristo has few surprises left for me, but it's been a good many years since I read the whole thing. I think the last time I read the whole thing was, in fact, here in a month when I was supposed to be studying for my doctoral general examinations, but was reading Dumas instead. With effort, I say I found him. I then said, so maybe what I will do is read long works in snippets at idle moments for self-edification. So there then tumbled into the machine Montaigne's Essays in an old translation, followed by The Anatomy of Melancholy, a perfectly wonderful sort of book that I've read in and around and up one side of and down the other for many years, never read all the way through. I then realized that I needed to see if I could find the funniest book ever written to have in my Kindle, and I did. That's Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome, to say nothing of the dog, but that's another story. Then I began to think, so perhaps biblical texts. How about the Septuagint? How about the Latin Vulgate? How about the King James Version? With great effort, I found a reliable King James Version, I think. My bookmark in that is somewhere around Potiphar's wife, and I haven't been back to that in some weeks now. I also found a great many highly unreliable biblical texts along the way. The only Greek text of the New Testament I could find was one which essentially has been rejiggered to make it compatible with the King James Version, because we all know that God wrote the King James Version and meant all other versions to be compatible with that. I downloaded a sample from that and deleted as fast as I can. I can't find much of the Latin Bible except the Psalter, so I found that. Well, my noble idea that I would have this around with me and at serene and wistful moments I would read a few pages of Montaigne or Dumas or Robert Burton hasn't actually worked in the last couple of months. Interesting sort of practice. The value, I say, of this, the unmistakable virtue, is that you can have lots and lots and lots of that stuff. If, on the other hand, your reading practices don't make you go back to that stuff, then it's not quite clear exactly what value is there. There's a little bit of what has been described for me as the iPod phenomenon, where you load up the iPod with all of your favorite music and then realize that one reason your favorite radio station is your favorite radio station is they play something besides your favorite music, and you actually hear something new from time to time, whereas on your iPod, you need to stop and think about whether there's something new and go out and look for it in order for there to be something new. And meanwhile, if you're me, you're beginning to get a little tired of Mahler just now, but there's a lot of Mahler on my iPod. All right. In a way, this has become for me the functional equivalent, traveling with me everywhere I go, of my bedside table at home. Now, my bedside table at home is a particular kind of reading device. It is a place where good intentions are piled, most of those good intentions with bookmarks about halfway through them. Periodically, because the bedside table cannot hold an infinite quantity of text, there needs to be a rueful encounter of good intentions, with some sluicing out and some removal, so that new good intentions may be piled on top of the old one, especially when some of them are copies of the New Yorker that are slippery and things keep falling off on the floor. There is value, but I'm not entirely sure of the value. Since I went on my self-edification campaign, I have been more prudent about what I have acquired, and I have in fact bought, by actual count, 5 books. Real books, all of them under $10. So one is a new novel by John Banville called The Infinities. I've never been really sold on Banville, but on the other hand, this is a novel in which Greek gods appear in more or less contemporary Ireland as characters in the novel, and I'm working on paganism just at the moment, so I was curious to see what he did. And the Kindle version is cheaper than the new hardcover, which is the only other way in which I can find it. So what the heck? That has the distinction of being the first book that I think I have actually read all the way through from cover to cover. However, at a rather high rate of speed, and I don't think I could pass a very detailed quiz on the contents. I also read Luc Menand's new book, The Marketplace of Ideas. It's a skinny little book of 4 essays about the state of higher education. It's the sort of book that goes home and gets on the bedside table and probably does get skimmed most of the way through before it goes back to where it came from. I probably should have gotten that from a library, but instead, once again, cheaper than the new hardcover, and there was something satisfying about being able to bring it home, read it, and delete it. And I will say that deleting books on the Kindle, if you have not had this experience, is far less guilt-ridden than throwing away a physical book. I'm not sure how the two activities actually differ from one another, but I feel no guilt whatsoever when I hit the delete button on the Kindle. I've now purchased 3 more. One is a scholarly book. I will forbear from mentioning it, but it is an expensive scholarly book, newly published, which I am sure that I will not like. I am sure that I will not read it from cover to cover, But having it in my possession for $9.99 so that I can leaf through it, source through it, have an idea what's going on in it, go back to it from time to time, cuss a little bit, spit a little bit, fuss and fume a bit, and then at some point, indeed, have the pleasure and satisfaction of hitting the delete key on that particular title is also an attractive prospect now to look forward to. There are 2 more novels that have now arrived. They are novels of a kind which are related to my day job, novels of ancient Rome, one a mystery, one a thriller, Robert Harris and Stephen Saylor. These are very popular books, very well done. I have a particular problem with them, as I had with the TV series Roma, which is that I can't read them without feeling like I'm at work, and murder mysteries and thrillers aren't supposed to feel like work. I have an idea that I will again skim through them. And one of the reasons I will skim through them is built into the device. If you've not seen one, this is what you get. And there are the buttons that say next page. And when you are reading anything, you can sit and click, and the next page displays about as fast as you see that flash of black. What I discover is that indeed with that, and with only about 150 to 200 words visible on the screen at one time, I can pick up speed. I can zoom through some things. Well, the scholar in me is happy to get through content at a high rate of speed and very unhappy to get through content at a high rate of speed because I don't read content when I am being a scholar. I pay more attention to the things that sit in front of me. I think the functions of the device are better accorded to a certain kind of, as we say nowadays, ludic reading, reading for pleasure. That is to say, the kind of reading I impute to other people reading murder mysteries on railroad trains. I'm sure I do a much better job of reading the murder mysteries than they do, but they are not me, so they are simply reading in a mindless way. But even if I think of this for ludic reading, it falls short of some of my standards. When every book is the same size and shape, looks the same, feels the same, click, 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 there's something missing. This is not a high intellectual cultural value that is missing, but there's something that I'm used to that is missing. I am used to books being different. I am used to each one having a different feel, a different size, a different shape. I know the satisfaction of leafing through a slender volume of poetry. The Duino Elegies are one kind of a book, and the Count of Monte Cristo is a very different kind of book. In here, they are both click, 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 with a little slider bar going across the bottom of the screen, and the difference is the slider bar goes faster when there are fewer pages. That doesn't feel the same. The page size is a problem for me. Too few words, too many clicks, too much speed of clicking, too much speed of reading. I realize that the practice I see emerging for myself is not so much ludic reading as ludic reading. That is to say, the kind of reading in which I am a consumer of information. I am a consumer of a processed item. The things I am reading in here feel to me now like Velveeta, not like cheese. And I will acknowledge that I eat Velveeta from time to time, but I will also acknowledge that Velveeta is not cheese. I also then realized one more thing, literally just last night as I was packing up to come here. I never read this at home. It's only a travel accessory. Because at home, there are, I hesitate to think, a lot of other things I could be reading, a lot of other enticements to my attention. And when I look at this object, it feels like one thing, whereas all the other books on all the shelves and all the pile on the bedside table and all the pile by the chair in the living room and all the pile on the table in the living room and all the pile on the desk and the ones out on the kitchen table and all the other ones at the office are many, many more. And some part of the pleasure of ludic reading is the pleasure of going shopping and browsing among the books with which you have surrounded yourself in order to find the one that fits just right for now. Maybe I can learn someday how to find the book in here that fits just right for right now. I haven't done that yet, and I don't quite know how to train myself to do it. Well, I come to the end of those reflections and pull back and try to make sense of this device as a whole. And it's when I do that that I made for myself the discovery that surprises me most about this device. It may be too obvious for others, but it was a revelation for me. And that is that first, in ways I have outlined, this device allows me to engage in a very selected and limited set of reading practices. There are a lot of other kinds of reading that I know how to do, that I care about doing, that I want to do, and I want to be able to do everywhere I go. But then I had the revelation. It's not just that it's a limited set of practices. All of the practices this device allows are old practices. They are practices of linear reading of a flat text that has been downloaded from someplace else. You may read it as rapidly as possible. You may leaf back and forward through it. But there's nothing innovative about the kind of reading you engage in. The device is innovative on multiple levels. It's a gadget. You can make it this flat. You can give it this much battery life. You can download text to it in a matter of seconds. All that feels like innovation. But the reading practices are so limited a subset of forms of reading that it almost feels like a parody of what reading is like or could be. There's no innovation in this device. What would innovation look like? Well, one form of innovation would be to give me good indices where I could begin the book at the index and click on the page numbers in the index going and looking for things, starting from the back forward. A good index is a beautiful thing in a book. I've read many of them. I enjoy them. It's of almost no value in this device. Wouldn't it be fun, I say to myself, if I had a device, it needn't be much bigger than this, where I could be reading the text in one language and listening to the translation in another language. And maybe I'd be reading the language I know better and listening to it in the language I know less well, or vice versa. I'd like to do that on a train sometime. I'd like to do that in lots of places sometime, with the text and translation lined up with each other just carefully. Can't do it with this device. Maybe someday you will be able to. It's probably likely that these devices will evolve in competition by offering new kinds of services. But at the moment, this one, the other ones that are out there, the other ones that people are talking about, have selected a form of reading which is limited and old-fashioned and of widespread social consumption value. People know how to sit down with a cheap paperback and turn the pages from the beginning to the end and call that reading a book. That is reading a book. There are many more things in the world that can be reading a book. I thought when I sat down to do this that I would be telling you with some venturesomeness about what kinds of reading I could imagine that you might do with this that I'm just too obtuse to do yet, but I'm sure there are people who are doing them. I can't find any. I can't think of any. That means I need to spend some time in the next weeks and months paying attention to what other people do. There probably are things that you can do with this device that I haven't thought of yet. But none of them are presenting themselves to me. None of them are making me aware of possibilities in reading that I didn't know before. As I was getting off the train this afternoon, I suddenly realized what book I had almost been thinking of all the way through the time I've been working on this talk. And that's a relatively recent title by the French scholar Pierre Bayard. This is the man who wrote the book called Who Killed Roger Ackroyd, in which he explains to you who really killed Roger Ackroyd in the Agatha Christie novel called The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. It's an important work of literary criticism. The only problem is he still doesn't know who really killed Roger Ackroyd. I'm the one who knows who really killed Roger Ackroyd, and they're both wrong. Bayard is an inventive literary scholar, however, as that indicates. His most recent book is called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. The title was designed to get exactly that giggle from you. Most of the reviews that have been in journals and magazines are by people who are giggling while they write the review. It's actually a very serious book, one of the most interesting books of literary criticism I've read in a long time, about our reading practices. The way some of our reading practices consist of how we have read a book that we read 5 years ago or 30 years ago, and we've read it, and we can talk about it, and we know about it, but what we're remembering is just a small subset of what we have remembered and what we have done. I found myself, I say, getting off the train in New Haven, wishing that Pierre Bayard had invented the Kindle rather than Jeff Bezos. And I think, finally, tools leave traces and inventors leave traces on their tools. And I think that's probably the last thing that I learned. I've had the suspicion for many years, looking at a variety of computer products that have been developed, that the great secret of modern time is that Steve Jobs can't type. If Steve Jobs could type, I argue, then his company would have produced far fewer devices that are so maddeningly frustrating to use for those of us who have 10 fingers. And fewer people would be stabbing touch screens with one finger at a time, trying to create words out of doing that. My discovery from this device at the end of the day is that I come away with a sneaking suspicion that in the ways in which I've talked about reading, in the forms of reading that I think are possible and desirable, the forms of reading that this kind of building as a temple of reading was designed to facilitate and invent and foster and continue. When you talk about real reading, I think it may make sense at the end to say that Jeff Bezos probably doesn't really like to read either. And that's too bad for him, for the device, and for those of us who are trying to make some sense out of the device as we go back to our reading. So my last prop is, of course, another form of Kindle. This is from the Universelle Bibliothek of the Reklam Publishing House in Germany. It has the Latin and German of letters of Cicero to Atticus on facing pages. This goes well on the train as well. You'll see it's even more compact. And you can spend a lot of time in this volume, almost as much as you can in one of these devices. So far, this hasn't killed that. Thank you.